Maigret had risen earlier than usual, stirred not by duty, but by the slow, creeping light that filtered through the curtains of his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir. The radiator was groaning again, working unevenly, more clanking than heat. His pipe sat untouched on the table beside the morning's Le Matin, folded but unopened. Madame Maigret was already in the kitchen, humming low as she prepared coffee. Her silhouette calm behind the frosted glass. The smell of burnt toast lingered. Her second try. Probably. He didn't mention it. There had been no urgent call. In the night, no telegram, no knocks at the door. But something itched, a vague restlessness that came not from anticipation, but absence. Maigret hadn't been called to a scene in nearly 4 days. And while he never admitted it aloud, the silence itself sometimes felt suspicious. He took his coffee slowly, gazing out at the morning traffic that sputtered along the damp street. A butcher's boy pedaled by, scarf flapping, wheels spraying slush, across the road. A widow he often saw struggled with her latch, cursing the cold. Paris looked unchanged, grey, wet, half awake. Yet Maigret watched it the way a farmer watches. A sky that doesn't feel quite right. It was nearly 8 when the phone rang, a sharp, metallic trill that seemed louder than it should have in their quiet apartment. Madame Maigret opened the kitchen door, but said nothing. Her eyes simply met his, knowing. He didn't rush. He placed the cup on its saucer, stood, and buttoned his coat before lifting the receiver. It was Inspector Lognon, tentative, apologetic as always. His voice crackled with unease. "There's a concierge down at the Hettel Central, Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis. Says their night clerk didn't turn up for the morning changeover. Desks empty, room locked, no note." Maigret said nothing for a moment. His free hand moved toward the pipe, but thought better of it. "That's all? Well, he's never missed a shift in 15 years, sir. Doesn't even drink, according to the owner." They found the register open to the same date. Cigarette in the ashtray. Everything looks normal. Just, he's gone. Maigret replaced the receiver without comment, then turned to his wife, who had already set a scarf on the back of the chair. "You'll need your heavier coat," she said. He nodded, taking the scarf and coat. No words were exchanged about the case. There rarely were, not at the start. The Hettel Central was one of those places tourists never noticed. Narrow doorway, so dark in stone, flower box with plastic geraniums. Inside, the air was thick with radiator heat and last night's smoke. A woman behind the reception counter, dyed hair, gold chain, fingers stained with hair dye or maybe nicotine, gestured stiffly toward the desk near the front, where a second chair sat empty. "That's where he should have been," she said, voice clipped. "Louis, always on time, never complained. That ashtray, he never used more than 1 cigarette per shift. Habit." Maigret didn't take notes. He simply looked at the ledgers, the dusted bell on the desk, the umbrella still hanging on the hook by the door. He asked, "Anyone leave early this morning?" She hesitated. "Room 12. That actor, the one who always borrows francs for cigarettes, said he had to get to a casting. And a man in 9, the English one, quiet, said nothing." Left around 6. Anyone come in late? No, just the usual from upstairs. I heard a bang around 3. Thought it was pipes. Lewis would have checked, but no one called. Maigret walked to the desk. The ledger was open, the pen beside it uncapped. One room was checked out. Room 7. No initials, just a long black line across the signature field. It didn't seem like much, but Maigret felt the nudge again. Not suspicion, just discomfort. Like an itch beneath a glove. He turned to Lognon, who stood awkwardly behind him, shifting weight from foot to foot. Have someone check room 7. Maigret said, quietly, don't wake the whole place. Lognon nodded and disappeared down the hall. The woman behind the desk lit a fresh cigarette. You don't think something happened to him, do you? Maigret didn't answer. His eyes lingered on the key hooks, neat rows, little brass tags. Lewis's key was gone. He turned toward the door, letting the cold seep in again as he stepped outside in the grey light of morning. Maigret stood under the hotel's awning, pipe in hand, unlit, watching. The street. No body, no blood. Just an empty chair, a used ashtray, and the strange quiet that follows someone who vanishes without noise. The kind of quiet that lingers, waiting for questions to rise on their own. He didn't know why, but he couldn't let it go. Maigret stayed outside for several minutes after leaving the desk. The cold helped him think. Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis was waking up slowly. Bread vans groaned past the curb. A woman with a cane moved stiffly along the opposite sidewalk, pausing now and then as though she had forgotten where she was going. The Hedel Central looked like dozens of others in that district, unremarkable, worn, with a facade that once aspired to something elegant, but had long since accepted its condition. Maigret lit his pipe and took only one puff before slipping it back into his coat. The tobacco wasn't drawing inside. The warmth hit him again. Unpleasant after the street. Lognon returned from upstairs, wiping his hands on his coat as if he'd touched something he shouldn't have. Room 7 is empty, he said, not meeting Maigret's eyes. The bed's made, but the sheets are damp. Windows slightly ajar. Bathroom. Mirror steamed up. Whoever stayed there left recently, very recently. Maigret nodded once. Did the register say who was there? No name, just a long dash. Maybe the clerk forgot to ask, or someone didn't want to say. That didn't sit right. Lewis, the missing night clerk, was described by everyone as precise, overly. So, neat ledger entries, tidy desk, single cigarette per shift. The kind of man who'd correct a misplaced comma in someone else's handwriting. Forgetting to take down a guest's name didn't fit. The woman behind the desk was staring at them. She was chewing her nail, the tip stained orange from tobacco. He wouldn't just go. She said again, Lewis, not even for a girl. He didn't have girls, not as far as we knew. Maigret said nothing to that. He preferred not to close any door too soon. He went back to the desk, lowering himself slowly into the night clerk's chair. He let his fingers run across the worn wood. The groove of habit was there. Fingers had rested on this surface, same position, night after night. The ashtray held a stub only half-smoked. Its edge still held a faint ember's mark, now cold. The ledger was in order, aside from room 7. The telephone was in place, no message slips. The radio behind the counter had been left on low, a music station. Chanson playing under the crackle. Lognon shifted beside him, eager to do something but unsure what. "Go upstairs," Maigret said without looking. "Start with room 9, the Englishman. Ask if he saw or heard anything. Then room 12, the actor. Be polite. Don't press. Just let them talk." Lognon nodded, grateful to be given a direction, and trotted off again. Footsteps thudding too loudly on the old stairs. Maigret leaned back in the chair and listened. The lobby was quiet now, a drip from the radiator, the soft buzz of the lights. Overhead, a guest shuffled behind a door upstairs. The place wasn't pretending to be more than it was, a hotel for small people with small routines. And yet someone had left without signing out. And Lewis, the man who kept this ship tidy, was gone, leaving no message. He rose and walked behind the counter, opening the drawer beneath. Inside were spare matches, a folded scarf, some receipts, and a small paperback with a bent spine. Le Mystère des Messengers, a detective story, perhaps. The corner of a photograph peeked from between the pages. Maigret slipped it free. A man, perhaps Lewis, stood beside a bicycle. Beside him was a boy, 10 or 11, not smiling. The background was unremarkable, a park fence, autumn trees. The man looked square-shouldered, unsmiling, the sort who'd never pose unless asked several times. Maigret replaced the photo. Footsteps returned. Lognon again. "Room 9, the Englishman," he said. "Name's Marchand. Odd name for an Englishman. But his passport's real. He says he came in around 10, left at 6, saw nothing. Barely noticed the clerk." Maigret nodded. "And room 12. Lognon frowned. "He's not there. Door unlocked. Room empty. Bed slept in. A suitcase is there, but no coat, no shoes. Bathroom window open, the second inch." Maigret stepped back around the counter and walked. Upstairs himself, the narrow staircase was carpeted in a pattern that must have been read once. At the landing, the hallway stretched dimly left and right, papered in beige with damp patches near the ceiling. Room 12 was on the right. Door open. Maigret entered slowly. The room was small, a sink in the corner, a brass-framed mirror. The bed was rumpled. The pillow bore the shape of a restless sleeper. The wardrobe stood ajar, one hanger swinging slightly. The suitcase on the floor was unlocked. Inside, a few shirts, a theatre program, and a bottle of cologne. On the desk, a torn envelope addressed to André Volney. No return address. Maigret sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. Something had made this man leave early, a disappearance at the same time. Too neat to be coincidence. He stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the alley, a row of bins. A cat stretched and slinked away. Rain had darkened the cobbles, but no footprints. He didn't need them. Back downstairs, the woman at the desk asked, "Find something?" Maigret didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "Did Volney, the man in 12, receive any visitors last night? She squinted. I think a man in a coat, around midnight, stayed only 10 minutes, left without a word. What did Lewis say about it? Nothing. He wrote it down in the log. Margaret looked again. Midnight. One name entered and crossed out. V. Just that a man visits room 12. The clerk notes it, then crosses it out. The man in 12 disappears. The clerk disappears. Margaret said softly, "Log non. Get the records from the last 3 nights, and find out if anyone around here knows a man named Volney." He paused, "and check who might know Lewis outside of this place, his habits, where he walked, who he called." Lognon wrote quickly. Margaret lit his pipe again, and this time it caught. Smoke rose slowly as he stared at the door. Someone had vanished, but not into thin air, just into silence. Margaret remained seated at the far end of the Hotel Central's lobby, positioned not quite behind the desk and not quite among the guests. It was an awkward chair, slightly sunken in the middle and creaking when he shifted, but he stayed there all the same, pipe smoke curling upward as his eyes moved slowly across the small details of the room. He wasn't watching for something dramatic. He rarely did, but rather for small changes. Instinctive movements, the natural discomfort people carry when truth is near. The kind of shift in posture or gaze that tells more than 100 words. Lognon returned a little after 9 with a notebook pressed flat in his hand, and the collar of his coat still damp. His expression, as usual, was halfway between exasperated and mildly apologetic. He handed the notebook to Margaret without a word. Maigret flipped through the pages. The records from the last 3 nights were methodically copied, line by line. Lognon had taken care with it, perhaps knowing Margaret disliked laziness more than incompetence. Room 12, Volney, had stayed 3 nights. No guests listed until the man with a V initial at midnight last night. That entry, Margaret now saw, had been crossed out more forcefully than he first thought. A deliberate act, not casual correction. Elsewhere, the notes were clean. No oddities, except perhaps one. The clerk Lewis had logged his own break at 3:10 a.m., an unusual time for someone who rarely stepped outside the front door. "You said he never left during shifts?" Margaret asked the desk woman again. "Not unless he was ill, or if the lavatory backed up. But I didn't hear him go out last night. He must have gone quiet." "If he did," Margaret turned to Lognon. "The residents, I spoke to 5 so far. The couple in room 5 heard nothing. The girl in 8 said she thought she heard someone walking down the hall past 2 a.m. But that's not unusual. The man in 10, an old piano teacher, thinks the place is haunted and refused to answer my questions. Unless I had holy water." Margaret almost smiled. "And room 3, unoccupied. Room 6, an elderly woman, widow, deaf." Margaret looked back at the list. The Englishman in room 9, Marchand. His check-in had also been 3 nights ago, like Volney. But Marchand had left at 6 that morning, and his record was otherwise unremarkable. Still, it was the symmetry that struck Margaret. To new guests, 3 nights. 1 missing, 1 early departure. Did you speak with Marchand in his room or in the lobby? Maigret asked. In his room. Did he seem packed? Suitcase was shut. Bed made. But he hadn't called for breakfast. Where did he say? He was going, didn't. Just said he had errands. Maigret tapped his pipe gently against the edge of the chair. We'll find him. But not yet. Let's not spook him. Outside, the drizzle had shifted to a finer mist, and Maigret decided to take a short walk. He didn't say where, but his feet carried him a few blocks down to a narrow alley behind a bakery, where the rear entrance of the hotel faced an unused courtyard. He stood there for several minutes, noting the bins, the rusted drain pipe, the water-streaked wall where pigeons perched quietly. There was no rear camera, no concierge watching this side. A man could leave from here and vanish into the streets unnoticed. A door opened somewhere above, and a bucket of water was emptied onto the pavement without warning. It splashed near his feet, but missed. He didn't look up. Back at the hotel, a local postman came in, rubbing his hands together and stamping his feet. He gave a nod to the woman at the desk, who reached into the drawer for a few letters, mostly junk, and handed them over. One envelope caught Maigret's attention, addressed in neat but slightly shaky script to Monsieur Louis Morel, care of Hettle Central. The stamp was from Rouen. Can I see that? Maigret asked, and the postman glanced at the woman before handing it over. Maigret turned it over in his hand. It had been posted yesterday. No return address, but the ink was faded in places as if the writer had paused often. You know who sends these? Maigret asked. Same handwriting comes once every few months. The woman replied. We always give them straight to Louis. He never mentioned who they were from. Sometimes he'd just put them in his coat pocket and not open them for days. Maigret slipped the envelope into his coat. You think he was hiding something? She asked. I think people hide things for reasons that often don't look like reasons at all. She didn't reply, but she understood enough not to press. Further. By noon, Maigret had eaten nothing and felt no hunger. He stood again in room 12, now sealed off by a cloth rope and a note from the police. Volney's belongings were untouched, but it was the absence that filled the space. The single toothbrush, no photographs, the carefully folded clothes. It didn't feel like a man on holiday. It felt like a man passing through or running from something. A knock on the door interrupted him. Lognon stepped in with his coat off and a file in his hand. We got something. Volney isn't a real name. Checked with the theatre listed in the program. No one by that name ever worked there. But the man's photo matched an old arrest from 7 years ago. Fraud, minor check scheme. Real name's Claude Revers. Maigret nodded. That explained the lack of detail. Was he connected to anyone locally? We're checking. But there's more. Louis Morel, the clerk, has a sister in Rouen, lives alone, sends letters once a season, sometimes less. No phone. She hasn't heard from him in a year. Maigret pulled out the envelope. Then this is likely hers. Lognon exhaled through his nose. If she hasn't heard from him in a year, why did she send this now? Maigret studied the handwriting again. Because she was due to write. Because habit isn't about what you remember. It's about what you do anyway. The silence between them lingered. A man who writes letters to himself through the hands of a sister he never answers. A guest under a false name who arrives and vanishes after a midnight visitor. A clerk who steps out for a break and leaves no trace. Maigret rubbed his brow slowly and returned to the lobby. The guests had begun to descend one by one. The widow from 6, the couple from 5, a boy carrying his mother's bag. All quiet, all curious, but not one asked directly what was happening. Maigret spoke to none of them. He watched the afternoon passed in small movements. A coat slipped on, a newspaper folded. Keys passed across the desk. But when room 9's guest, the Englishman, Marchand, reappeared just after 3, Maigret sat straighter. Marchand wore a herringbone coat and carried no bag. He stepped out into the mist, glanced up the street, then back toward the desk as if checking whether anyone was watching. He didn't see Maigret, but Maigret saw him, not the look of a man running, but one who knows he should have left sooner, who'd lingered too long out of caution, and now wasn't sure if staying or fleeing would look guiltier. Maigret tamped his pipe and stood. Coat in hand, he turned to Lognon. Follow him, at a distance. Don't lose him. Don't speak. And you? I'm going to find out why Claude Revers came to this hotel under another name, and what he might have said to Louis Morel before both men disappeared. Lognon nodded and left without a word. Maigret watched the doorway. The drizzle had returned, not with force, but with insistence, soft, steady, and quiet, like guilt seeping through an old floorboard by for a clock. The clouds had gathered low over Paris, the kind that flattened color and made every building appear grayer than it was. Inside the Hettel Central, the radiator coughed now and then as if reacting to the dampness, and the desk lamp beside Maigret buzzed faintly with age. He had not moved much since Lognon left to follow Marchand. Instead, he sat with Claude Revers. Sparse belongings spread before him on the counter, the theatre program folded in half, the torn envelope from the drawer, a small address book with barely a dozen entries, all written in the same neat hand. He flipped open the program again. Theatre de l'Aurore, Revue de Minuit, 3 weeks old. A line drawn under a name, Lucien Delorge, second billed actor. There was no note, no explanation, but the underline was precise, not careless. It had meaning for the man who made it, even if it wasn't apparent now. Maigret stared at it for a while, eyes heavy but focused. Then he reached for the hotel phone and dialed the switchboard operator at the Quai des Orfèvres. "Put me through to Inspector Janvier, if he's there," he said. There was a brief wait. Then Janvier's warm voice came on the line, cheerful as always. "Yes, Chief? Find Lucien Delorge, actor. Last performance at Theatre de l'Aurore, Revue de Minuit. I want to know where he lives and what he's been doing for the last month." "Understood. And one more thing. Claude Revers, alias. See if there's any record of him contacting anyone recently, especially former victims or cellmates. Quiet inquiries. Will do. Margaret hung up slowly and returned to the small notebook. The address book entries were sparse, but one caught his attention. MMES, -17 Rue de la Forge Royale. No surname, no phone. He pocketed the book and stood, reaching for his coat. It was a quiet enough lead, and quiet leads often meant more. Then noise. The walk to Rue de la Forge Royale took 20 minutes. The air was cold but not punishing, and the streets grew narrower the farther he walked. Small stores, shuttered windows, iron balconies. Number 17 was a low, slouched building with chipped steps and a muddy courtyard. He rang the bell beside a rusted plaque that read only MMES. The door opened after a moment, revealing a woman in her 60s, wrapped in a brown shawl and blinking against the outside light. She looked Margaret over with narrowed eyes, the way someone does when trying to recall a vague memory. "Madam," Margaret said, removing his hat. "My name is Margaret. I'd like a word, if I may, regarding a man named Claude Revers." Her expression did not change, though her hands fidgeted with the knot of her shawl. "You'd better come in," she said, her voice dry as cracked earth. Inside, the apartment was modest, to warm, and smelled faintly of boiled cabbage. A mantel clock ticked loudly, marking time that didn't feel like it moved. She gestured to a chair near the window and sat down opposite him. "Your police," she said plainly. "So you already know the bad part." Margaret didn't respond, simply waited. "He came here 2 days ago. First time in over 6 years. Looked thinner, sadder, but still with that smile that never quite reached the eyes." "Did he tell you his real name?" "He never used it here. He was always Claude, though I knew better. He used to stay with my daughter years ago, when she still had a stage name and bad taste in men. She's in Lyon now, married. No letters. And you—" I forgave him, or thought I did. But then he turns up again. No coat, just his scarf and a story. Said he was being followed. Said someone from the old days had recognized him, and he needed a place to lie low. I told him I had no bed for him. He said he didn't plan to stay. Did he say who recognized him? No, just that it was someone who had a long memory and a short temper. That's what he said. I didn't ask more. Did he seem frightened? No. But tired, as if running wasn't new to him, just harder now. Margaret studied her face. "Do you believe he was telling the truth?" "I believe he believed it. Whether it was real or guilt, I can't say." "Did he mention the Hettle Central?" "Yes. Said he was staying there under a false name. Asked me not to tell anyone if they came asking. I didn't think the police would be first. He's missing," Margaret said simply. She blinked once. "That fits. Did anyone come after him here?" "Not that I saw." "Did he leave anything with you?" "No." "Can you describe his mood when he left?" She hesitated, resigned, as if something had already happened, and he was just walking through the end of it. Margaret stood. "Thank you, madam." As he turned to go, she said, "He was never violent, you know, just careless with hearts and debts." Back on the street, the mist was thicker, turning to a light drizzle that coated his hat and shoulders. Margaret didn't bother to brush it off. His steps were slow, methodical, the kind of walk where thoughts range themselves without needing to be forced. Back at the hotel, Lognon was waiting. Marcha and went to a cafe on Rue Paradis, sat alone for an hour, didn't speak to anyone, left by foot. I followed him as far as Gare de l'Est. He bought a ticket to Nancy. Train leaves tonight. Maigret nodded. Let him go. We'll send word to the station master to alert us if he returns. But don't stop him. Lognon blinked. You think he's clean? I think he's scared. But not of us. He handed the man Claude Rever's file. Start building a list of his contacts, past cellmates, old associates. Quietly, someone recognized him. Someone has a reason to silence him. Lognon opened the file and flipped through it. Eyes narrowing. There's a name here, Michel Fourier, convicted with Revers in 48. Got out a year ago. Where? Marseille. But last known visit to Paris was 3 weeks ago. Maigret nodded slowly. How the station reach out? No alarms, no noise. Just find him. Lognon nodded and left. Maigret returned to the chair by the desk, feeling the day press against his shoulders. A clerk disappears without luggage. A man with a fake name is seen with a mysterious visitor and vanishes hours later. The hotel, unchanged. The guests, uneasy. The staff, resigned and still. The missing Louis Morel lingered more in the silence. Then the fax.maigret tapped the pipe on the edge of the ashtray and muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. A man who disappears is either hiding or being hidden. And Louis didn't look like the type to run. The desk woman approached him quietly. You asked earlier if Louis had friends. I remembered something. He used to visit a bookseller once a week. Near Canal Saint-Martin, small shop. Owner called him the man who rereads everything. Might be worth asking. Maigret looked up at her. Why didn't you mention it earlier? I didn't think it mattered. It was just Louis's thing. That and the letters from Rouen. It matters, Maigret said, rising. He stepped outside again. The drizzle was heavier now, coating the street in a sheen of light and wet pavement. Maigret walked slowly in the direction of the bookseller's shop, passing shuttered doors. Steam rising from drains, and pigeons huddled beneath awnings. Something had begun, not loudly, but with weight, the kind of thing that didn't start with a scream, but with a silence that refused to be ignored. The rain had grown steady by the time Maigret reached Canal Saint-Martin. Drops tapped evenly on his felt hat and clung to the shoulders of his coat, but he paid them no mind. The canal water looked dark and tired, reflecting the dull lights of the lamps flickering on early across the embankment. A lone barge moved slowly under the overcast sky, trailing ripples behind it like a man, carrying secrets down a corridor. Maigret lit his pipe under the lip of his collar, shielding the flame from the wind, and exhaled slowly. The bookseller's shop was just where the desk woman had said, tucked beneath a peeling awning between a shuttered laundrette and a cordonnery. The shop had no name above it, just a faded gold-lettered sign on the door. Lives d'occasion. Second-hand books. The display window was small, packed tightly with rows of yellowing spines. Some tilted, others buried. One book had slipped sideways and lay half open against the glass. Maigret pushed open the door, which gave with a reluctant creak. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of old paper and dust, not musty, simply old, like an attic someone had cared about once and then left alone. The shop was narrow, with wooden shelves from floor to ceiling. A small gas heater buzzed in the corner beside a threadbare armchair. Behind a cluttered counter, a thin man with large glasses and a heavy cardigan looked up with mild surprise. His face bore the pale, contented look of someone who spent more time with characters on the page than with real people. "Bonsoir," Maigret said, stepping inside and removing his hat. Water dripped from its brim onto the floor. "Forgive the intrusion." The man adjusted his glasses. "Please, come in. Close the door. I'll lose all the heat." Maigret obliged and moved slowly between the rows of books. There was no sound but the hum of the heater and the faint ticking of a clock. Somewhere near the back, the inspector made his way toward the counter and looked at the man carefully. "You've had a regular customer. Older gentleman. Walks with a slight limp. Dark overcoat. Usually comes on Tuesdays." The man blinked once, then again. "Ah, Louis. Yes, of course." Maigret raised an eyebrow. "You know his name?" "Only because he once paid with a check. Morel, I think. A quiet man, polite, always on time. He liked to reread Simenon and Mauriac. Never bought anything new. Always the same titles. Said he trusted what he'd already met." Maigret nodded. "Did he say where he worked?" "I assumed he was retired, or perhaps part-time somewhere. He never spoke of it." "When did you last see him?" The man thought. 5 days ago. He bought Les Angoisses de l'Aube and asked if I had another copy of La Chambre des Dames. I didn't. He said he'd come back Tuesday, but he didn't." The man shook his head. "I waited. It's rare that he misses a visit." Maigret glanced toward the back. "Did he ever speak of anyone following him?" "Following?" The man looked genuinely surprised. "He didn't. Strike me as the type to attract trouble. Did he ever meet anyone here? Wait for someone?" "No. In fact, he never stayed more than 15 minutes. In, browse, pay, nod, and out." Maigret reached into his coat and produced the small address book. "Do you recognize any of these names?" The bookseller glanced over it, shook his head. "Sorry. Did you notice anything different about him last time?" Another pause, then a small nod. "He looked tired, more than usual. His hands were shaking slightly when he took out his money. I thought it was the cold." Maigret pocketed the book. "Thank you." The bookseller hesitated as Maigret turned to leave. "Monsieur, is he missing?" "Yes." "Do you think he's in danger?" Maigret didn't answer immediately. "I think someone wanted him to disappear. Whether he agreed to it or not, I don't know yet." Outside, the rain had grown heavier. The inspector raised his collar and walked slowly along the canal, watching the reflections ripple across the black water. Somewhere, someone had made a quiet decision, a decision that had forced two men into silence. One vanished without a word, the other under a false name, There had been no violence, no body, but Margaret felt the shadow of something irreversible. Back at the station, Janvier was waiting, with a folder in hand. His coat was damp, and he smelled faintly of tobacco and wet wool. "We found Delorge," he said, handing over the file. "Lives on Rue Saint-Maur. Bit of a drunk. Minor theatre gigs. Used to work with Claude Revers in the late 40s. They were close, apparently." Margaret flipped through the pages. Anything recent? Revers showed up at his apartment 2 weeks ago. Neighbors remember a shouting match. Delorge denied it, of course, said he hadn't seen him in years. "And you believed him?" "No." Margaret nodded and put on his coat again. "Let's go." They arrived at the flat just after 6. The hallway reeked of wine and overcooked onions. On the 3rd floor, a door hung slightly ajar. Janvier knocked anyway. A voice answered, dry and slightly slurred. "It's open." They stepped in. Lucien Delorge sat in an armchair beside a cluttered table, 2 empty glasses, a half-full bottle. He looked older than his age, with the uneven wear of someone who had once been handsome, but had let the years carve him too deeply. He looked up, eyes unfocused, and smirked. "Let me guess. Claude's gone and someone wants answers." "Margaret, step forward. You tell me." Delorge poured himself a glass without offering one. He showed up. "Looked worse than I did. Said someone from the old days was sniffing around. Said he needed to disappear again." "Did he tell you who was after him?" "No names. Just old debts. And fear. Real fear. Not the kind you fake for sympathy." "What kind of debts?" Delorge laughed bitterly. Claude had a talent for charm, for lying, for making people believe they'd be the one he'd stick with. Women, men, lenders, colleagues. He used them all. Eventually, one of them doesn't forget. He always knew it would catch up. Margaret sat down across from him. "Did he mention a clerk? Louis Morel?" Delorge hesitated. "Only once. Said he was kind. That he didn't deserve what was coming. I didn't press. What was coming?" Delorge shrugged. "Claude never said goodbye. Not properly. Just left, like he always did." "Do you think he's dead?" Delorge finished his glass and didn't answer for a long time. "I think Claude wanted someone else to disappear in his place. That's the sort of thing he'd do." Margaret stood. "We'll be in touch." Outside, the night had fully settled. The rain showed no sign of stopping. In the distance, a clock chimed 7. Margaret lit his pipe again and exhaled slowly. A man had vanished. Perhaps willingly, perhaps not. But the scent of deception lingered, not just around Revers, but in every person he had touched, including Louis Morel, the man who reread the same books, who never changed his habits, and who perhaps had been caught in someone else's story, one he didn't understand until it was too late. Maigret stood on the curb outside Delorge's apartment building, the rain now soft enough to feel like damp breath against his cheek. The kind of rain that didn't announce itself but soaked through all the same. He didn't open his umbrella. It hung by his side, unopened like the questions that had followed him all day. Somewhere in the city, a man had disappeared, Another had fled, and a quiet clerk, who hadn't changed a habit in a decade, was missing without a ripple, except for the questions he left behind. He walked slowly toward the corner cafe, where he told Janvier to meet him. Inside, the warmth was instant and almost unwelcome. Steam fogged the windows, and the smell of onion soup, tobacco, and red wine curled through the air. Maigret ordered a beer and sat at a corner table, his coat dripping on the tile floor. Janvier arrived minutes later, brushing, droplets from his collar, face pink from the wind. "Word from Marseille," he said, sliding into the chair opposite. Michel Fourier checked into a pension near Montmartre 5 days ago. Fake name. But the landlady remembered him from old photographs. "We've got a man watching the place." Maigret nodded, unspeaking. Janvier took a sip from his own drink. "You think he's tied to Claude's disappearance?" "I think someone came to collect," Maigret said, his voice low, and Claude Revers had no more room to run. Janvier frowned. "What about Louis? Still no trace?" Maigret leaned back. "No body, no note, no calls, just silence. Could he be hiding?" Maigret shook his head. "No. Louis was steady, predictable. He lived like a timetable. He didn't vanish unless someone wanted him gone." He reached into his coat and withdrew the envelope from Rouen, the one Louis's sister had sent. He'd opened it earlier in the day, but only now read it again under the cafe's low light. The handwriting was clean, the lines precise. "Cher Louis, it is cold again here, and the cat has begun to sleep in the cupboard. I have taken your old coat to be patched, though I know you never liked it. Do write if you find the time. I will be here, as always, on Sundays. Simonino drama. No urgency, just habit. The kind that endures, even when the world around it doesn't." He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in his coat. "We need to speak to Fourier. Want me to bring him in?" Janvier asked. "No. I'll go." Quietly, they finished their drinks, and Maigret took a taxi to Montmartre. The building was unremarkable. Faded stucco, rusted balcony railings, and a chipped nameplate half obscured by ivy. He rang the bell and waited. A young man with a mop and a puzzled face opened the door. "Michel Fourier, second floor, right." The boy said, "He doesn't like visitors." Maigret climbed the stairs slowly. At the top landing, he paused and listened. A voice hummed behind one of the doors, low, off-key. Familiar with solitude, he knocked once. Silence. Then slow footsteps. The door opened a crack. Maigret held up his badge. "Michel Fourier?" The man opened the door further. Heavy-set, balding, eyes like dull marbles. He wore a sweater that didn't fit and trousers held up with string. "You've come about Claude," he said, voice flat. Maigret stepped inside. The room was dim, cluttered with old newspapers and clothes draped over chairs. The air smelled of old coffee and forgotten laundry. "What do you know?" Maigret asked. Fourier sat on the edge of the bed. "He owed me. That's what I know. Money, not just money. Years. Claude left me holding the bag in 48. I did 6 years. He did 6 months. He promised to fix it. He never did. Did you threaten him? I didn't need to. When a man like Claude knows you found him, he'll undo himself. Margaret watched him closely. Did you see him last week? I did. We spoke. He offered me a few thousand francs and a list of names to try elsewhere. He said he couldn't give me peace, but maybe he could buy my delay. And then I walked away. But someone else didn't. What do you mean? Poirot scratched his chin. He told me he'd borrowed from another man, a dangerous one. Said he'd used a new name and gotten too close to someone he shouldn't have. That this man had a long reach and a small heart. Margaret's expression didn't change. Name? He never said. But I think Claude knew his time was ending. You ever see a man look at his own shadow and flinch? Margaret nodded once. Did he mention Louis Morel? Poirot hesitated. The clerk? Yes. He said the man was kind. That he was. His only audience now. The only person who didn't know who he'd been. Margaret stood. Where did you see him last? Poirot looked up. On the canal, near the booksellers. He was standing still, watching the water, like he was waiting to be taken. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Margaret sat in his office, the windows fogged with evening chill. He poured himself a glass of Calvados and drank it slowly. He thought about Claude Revers, the liar, the charmer, the vanisher, a man who collected people the way others collect coins, admiring them until they stopped shining. And he thought of Louis Morel, the clerk who lived by habit, whose greatest act of risk had likely been showing kindness to the wrong man. Someone had come to. Silence. Claude. But Louis had disappeared not because of what he did, but because of what he saw. A borrowed coat, a voice raised, a slip of a name. Enough to become collateral. The phone rang, Janvier again. They found something, he said, beneath. Pont de la Grangeoc spells. A suitcase. Waited. Clothes inside. A name tag. Louis Morel. Margaret didn't speak. No body, Janvier added. Just the clothes. Clean. Folded. Margaret hung up the phone. Somewhere in Paris, someone had taken the time to dress a lie in silence. Carefully, precisely, and with just enough respect. To make it worse, the night deepened over Paris with a steady rhythm, and the fog that clung to the rooftops thickened as if it, too, wanted to hide something. In his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, Margaret sat with his back to the stove, the heat barely warming the soles of his feet. He stared at the file on his desk. Louis Morel, Night Clerk, age 57, no criminal record, no debts, no family in Paris, quiet, punctual, and missing. Across from him, the empty chair waited as it often did during these hours, as if someone had been expected but decided not to come. The suitcase under the Pont de la Grangeoc spells had confirmed what Margaret feared but could not. Except the clothes were folded, the tag intact, the contents unmistakably Moll's, and yet there was no body, no blood, no signs of struggle, just a message that spoke without words. He won't be coming back. He lit his pipe and let the smoke settle low over the desk. Claude Revers, alias Volney, had feared something or someone more than prison. Michel Fourier had found him, yes, but Fourier had walked away, bitter but spent. That kind of man made noise when he struck. But this was too neat, too careful. Someone had pressed the past into silence and left the surface undisturbed. The knock came just after 11. One knock, then silence. Maigret didn't call out. He simply stood, walked to the door, and opened it. The woman in the hallway was older than he expected, perhaps mid-60s, tall, straight-backed, with a green wool coat and a felt hat pressed down against her brow. Her eyes were sharp, tired but clear. She held a small purse in her gloved hands. "I was told you were looking for someone connected to Claude Revers," she said. No hesitation, just fact. Maigret stepped aside. "Come in." She sat without invitation and removed her gloves slowly. The room grew still around her, as if her presence had its own weather. "I'm Madame Yaubert," she said. "I don't suppose the name means anything to you." "It doesn't," Maigret said. He offered no apologies. She gave a thin smile. "It shouldn't." Claude made a habit of changing names as easily as addresses. "I knew him when he was calling himself Paul Viret." Maigret sat down across from her. "How long ago?" 10 years. Maybe 11. He stayed with me for 7 months. Said he'd left the theatre, that he wanted peace. He stole my father's watch and left a note that said, "Some debts can't be paid in time." "Why come now?" She didn't blink. "Because I saw him last week. He was standing across from my apartment on Rue Saint-Blaise. Just standing there. In the rain. He didn't move, didn't knock, just stood. I watched him from the window. Then he turned and left. That was Tuesday. That would be the day. Before he vanished," she nodded. "I thought he might return. He didn't. But today I saw the story in the paper about the missing hotel clerk, and something in me said, he left someone else behind this time." Maigret studied her. There was no hysteria in her tone, no bitterness, only the dryness of someone who had survived too much charm and too little remorse. "Did he say anything when he saw you?" "Not a word. Just looked up. I'm sure he knew I was watching." "What do you think he wanted?" She thought for a moment. "To be remembered, perhaps, or forgiven." "I wouldn't give him either." Maigret rose, walked to the stove, and refilled his pipe slowly. He didn't offer one to her. She didn't expect it. "Did he ever mention someone named Louis?" he asked. "Not by name. But he once described a man, older, quiet, who listened without judging. He said it was the first time in years he'd felt seen. And do you think he was capable of hurting someone like that?" Her eyes narrowed. Claude was capable of anything, as long as he didn't have to see the result. He believed in disappearing before the damage took form. Maigret nodded slowly. "Thank you." She stood and put her gloves back on. "If you find a body, don't tell me. I've buried him enough times already." She left without another word. The door clicked shut behind her like punctuation at the end of a forgotten chapter. Maigret remained standing, eyes on the window. The fog outside had thickened, obscuring the river. The street lamps, even the reflection of his own office, light Everything looked slightly dissolved. A phone rang. This time it wasn't his. It came from the main corridor, and seconds later Janvier stepped into the room, coat half buttoned. "That was the station at Gare de l'Est," he said, Marchand, "the Englishman from the hotel. He's back." Maigret turned. "Did he? Say why?" "No. But he's asking to see you. Said he made a mistake." Maigret put on his coat and followed Janvier downstairs. Gare de l'Est was nearly empty at that hour. The last departures were done, the waiting hall washed in weak light. The benches scattered with sleeping passengers. Marchand stood near the far window, suitcase beside him, hat in his hands. When he saw Maigret, he straightened, but his face didn't lift. "I lied," he said, "about the night of the disappearance. I suspected you had." Marchand looked past him, out into the fog. "I saw him, the clerk, around 2:30 in the morning. He came out of the hotel with a man, tall, dark coat, gloves. They didn't argue. They didn't even speak. They just walked together down the street. I thought it was nothing. I went back to bed. But when I woke up and saw the desk empty, something felt wrong. Why didn't you say anything before? I've been on the run before. Not from the law, from people. Debt, mostly. You start learning not to speak unless someone forces it from you." Described the man. Couldn't see his face clearly. He wore a scarf, but he moved like someone who expected not to be seen. Quiet, controlled. Where did they go? Toward the canal. Maigret stood silent for a moment, then asked, "Why come back?" Marchand gave a small laugh. "Because I realized the man I saw wasn't Claude Revers." Maigret looked at him. "I saw Revers earlier that night. He was arguing with someone in room 12. That man wasn't him." Maigret felt a click in the back of his mind. A door swinging open in a hallway he hadn't noticed. "Then who was it?" he asked. Marchand hesitated. I think it was someone Claude had tried to impersonate. Someone who finally caught up, back at the station." Maigret poured a second glass of Calvados and stared out the window as the fog rolled against. The panes, the canal, the clerk, the borrowed name, it all came down to a mistake. One Claude had made too many times. One someone had decided would be his last. But it wasn't Claude who had paid Dot, it was the man who reread the same books. Who lit one cigarette per shift? Who kept his head down and never asked for more? Louis Morel had vanished not because he was dangerous, but because he had become the mirror into which someone saw too much of their own face. At dawn, Paris sat beneath a blanket of fine fog that blurred every rooftop and softened the edges of the world. The city seemed suspended in its own breath, unwilling to wake. Maigret stood at his office window, arms crossed, pipe cold in his hand. He hadn't slept, not properly. The Calvados from the night before had warmed him, but not dulled the weight that had settled across his shoulders. A face seen, but not known. A man in a scarf. A borrowed identity. A man who was supposed to disappear, and another who had disappeared in his place. The phone rang at 6:20. It was Janvier again. "We found something," he said. Or rather, someone did. A woman walking her dog near the lock at Bassin. De La Valette. She found a wallet floating in the reeds. The ID inside belongs to Claude Revers. Maigret's grip on the receiver tightened slightly. No money inside. Just the ID, a tram ticket stub, and a dry cleaning receipt dated last week. Is it real? Looks like it. But there's something else. The receipt isn't from anywhere near the hotel. It's from a shop in Newley. Maigret hung up without answering and grabbed his coat. Newley, wealthy, discreet, and far from the world of second-rate hotels and vanishing clerks. Why would Claude Revers, or someone pretending to be him, be picking up dry cleaning there? By 7:30, he was standing in front of Pressing Leclerc, a quiet, white-tiled storefront with a gold-lettered window and a single bell above the door. The woman inside, round-faced and alert, looked up as he entered. "I'm looking for information about a customer," he said, showing his badge. "This man." He placed the photograph of Revers, clipped from an old arrest file, on the counter. She squinted, then nodded. "Yes, he's been coming for years. Always paid cash." Maigret's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Years? At least 4. Every other week, like clockwork." "Under what name?" She opened a small book from behind the register. "Gerard Vallin." Maigret felt the familiar tightening behind his ribs. Did he mention where he lived? No. But we always deliver to the same address. Rue de Longchamp, number 128, top floor. He thanked her, stepped out into the morning chill, and lit his pipe. Barely tasting the tobacco, Claude Revers hadn't simply vanished. He had been living a parallel life, not under assumed names in grimy boarding houses, but quietly, securely, with shirts pressed and trousers hung on padded hangers. While the rest of Paris knew him as a fraud, here in Newley, he had been someone else, someone respectable. By 8:15, Maigret was standing outside 128 Rue de Longchamp, a tall, whitewashed building with polished steps and brass fixtures, the kind of place where silence was maintained by mutual agreement, and every tenant had a concierge who never forgot a face. The concierge, a weary woman in a checkered robe, looked up from her crossword puzzle and blinked at him. "Gerard Vallin?" he asked. "Top floor," she said. "But he hasn't been in for 3 days. I thought he was away on business. He travels often." Maigret said nothing as he climbed the stairs. Each landing was spotless, the handrail polished, the bulbs freshly changed. At the top, he knocked once. No answer. He waited, then knocked again. Still nothing. He took a step back and listened. No sound. No movement. After a moment, he produced a small tool from his coat. Not a pick, but something meant to press quietly into worn locks. The door opened with a reluctant click. Inside, the apartment was sparse, modern, and clean. Not a bachelor's hideaway, but not a family home either. A place built on convenience. There were few personal touches, no photographs, no letters on the desk. But the wardrobe was full, and the cologne on the dresser was the same scent found in room 12 of the Hotel Central. It was him. Vallin, Revers, Volney, whoever he'd wanted to be. Maigret walked through the apartment slowly. The kitchen had Fresh bread, untouched. The refrigerator was nearly empty. On the bedside table sat a half-read copy of Le Monde, folded to an article about anonymous wealth and real estate shells. Tucked between the pages was a smaller clipping, barely larger than a cigarette box, detailing the mysterious disappearance of a hotel clerk named Louis Morel. So he had read it. Maigret sat on the edge of the bed, pipe unlit in his hand, and stared at the wardrobe. There were too many coats. He stood, opened the door slowly, and ran his hand through them. Linen, wool, cashmere, some too large, some too short. The kind a man keeps when he has no reason to discard what once served him. But near the back, nearly hidden, was a coat he recognized. Dark wool, slightly faded at the shoulders, a small tear in the right inner lining. It was Louis Morel's. Maigret took it out, laid it on the bed, and stared at it. He remembered what Marchand had said. The man who left with Louis wasn't Rivers. It had been someone else, someone wearing Louis's coat. Maigret stepped into the bathroom. Clean, spare, a shaving kit, a brush with grey hairs stuck between the bristles, and above the sink. In the small cupboard, 2 toothbrushes, one still wet. He stepped back into the main room and dialed Janvier from the apartment's phone. "We've been looking in the wrong direction," he said quietly. Claude Rivers didn't disappear. He staged a disappearance and slipped into someone else's skin. Janvier was quiet. "You mean, I think he's alive, and I think Louis Morel is not." Where would he go? Maigret looked at the bed again. Nowhere. He's already gone. The man we thought was Marchand may not be Marchand. The man we thought fled may never have left. He paused. "We need to speak to the concierge again. Ask if she's seen Valin since the story broke. And check with the hotel. See if any guests returned who matched Valin's build but gave a different name." As he hung up, Maigret walked to the apartment window and looked down at the street. A man could live 20 years in a city and never be known. All it took was a steady voice, clean shoes, and the right smile. Claude Rivers had done more than vanish. He had become someone else entirely, and all it had cost him was a quiet man in a hotel lobby. The only person who hadn't asked for lies. Maigret took his time descending the stairs of 128 Rue de Longchamp, each step measured. Almost reluctant, he carried nothing but the weight of what he now understood. Louis Morel's coat, found in the wardrobe of a man who was supposed to be missing, had spoken more clearly than any confession. It hadn't been Claude Rivers who disappeared. It had been Louis, silenced, erased, and replaced. And yet, no one had noticed. Not the concierge in Neuilly, not the residents of the hotel, not even the police, not at first. That was Rivers's skill, the ability to become part of the wallpaper until he chose to move. He hadn't vanished. He had stepped into someone else's life and left the original wearer behind in a weighted suitcase beneath the canal, outside. The sky remained a dull lid of grey, heavy and flat. Maigret turned up his collar, flagged a taxi, and rode in silence toward the Hettel Central. The streets grew narrower, the air thicker with morning traffic. As they turned onto Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis, Maigret leaned forward, stop at the corner. He stepped out and walked the remaining block on foot. The hotel looked unchanged. The brass bell, the cracked awning, the tired windows. He stood across from it for a full minute, watching. A man exited with a newspaper folded under one arm. A young woman in a housecoat stepped out for a cigarette. Inside, behind the glass, the day clerk, a thin, pale boy named Emile, tapped at the register and sipped from a chipped mug. Maigret crossed the street and entered quietly. Emile looked up and froze. Monsieur Maigret, I'd like the guest book again. The past 3 days. The boy nodded, already turning to retrieve it. Of course. We didn't expect. Did anyone return who had previously checked out? Emile blinked. Well, room 11. A man came back late yesterday. Gave a different name this time, Henry Lemoyne. But it's the same man who was here last week, I think. Maigret took the ledger and flipped to the last entry. Henry Lemoyne. Room 11. Checked in at 16:45. Paid in cash. No ID. Did he speak much? Maigret asked. No. Came in quiet. Wore a scarf, heavy coat. Didn't take the lift. Said he didn't need anything. No breakfast. No wake-up call. Maigret handed the book back. What time is he due out? Didn't say. Let him be. I'll go up myself. Room 11 was on the second floor, left of the stairwell. Maigret climbed slowly. The hotel was still. Muffled, a maid moved down the hall, pushing her cart gently, humming under her breath. She stepped aside when she saw him, eyes curious but unsurprised. At the door, he paused. The number plate hung slightly crooked. A small scratch ran beneath the keyhole. He knocked once. Nothing. Then again. A faint voice answered. Yes, police. Pause. Then, come in. Maigret opened the door and stepped inside. The man was seated in the armchair near the window, coat still on, scarf draped across the back of the chair. The room smelled faintly of stale cologne and damp wool. A single suitcase sat beside the bed, unopened. On the table was a book, La Peste by Camus, spine cracked, face down. Henry Lemoyne. Maigret said. The man met his gaze, or Claude Revers, whichever you prefer. Maigret said nothing. He walked to the window and stood beside it, watching the street below. Cars passed, honking now and then. A dog barked in the distance. Paris. Indifferent as always. You changed your coat. Maigret said quietly. I had to, Revers answered. The other was to clean. You kept his. It fit me better than anything I'd ever owned. Maigret turned. You wore another man's life, his coat, his shift, his habits. And when someone came looking, you let them take him instead. Revers didn't flinch. I didn't mean for it to happen. But when it did, I didn't stop it either. Who came for you? Revers looked down at his hands. I don't know his name. I only knew the voice. He'd called me before, threatened, said he'd found me again. I saw him once, across the lobby. I was in Lewis's coat. He must have thought that Lewis was you. Revers nodded. They left together, quietly. I don't think Lewis even knew he was in danger. He probably thought he was helping someone. Maigret didn't speak. I didn't move. Revers continued. I didn't call out. I watched them walk down the street. I waited until morning and then checked out. Then came here. Changed. Your name. Watched the papers. Yes, you saw your own death being reported. Revers gave a hollow laugh, a gift. Maigret stepped closer. You thought you'd escaped it. I thought maybe I could finally live. Not run, not scheme, just live. Maigret sat down in the chair opposite him. And Lewis, Revers looked at him then, eyes finally meeting Maigret's. He was the best man I'd ever met, and I used him like a coat. I know what that makes me. Maigret stared for a long moment. The silence between them filled the room, pressing in like fog. You know I'll have to take you in. I know. Do you want to make a statement? Revers looked down at the floor. Double quotes no. Double quotes Maigret rose. Then pack your things. Downstairs. Emile looked up as Maigret descended with Revers beside him, hands in his pockets, expression blank. The inspector didn't speak to the boy. He only opened the door and held it long enough for Revers to step into the cold. They walked slowly to the car waiting at the curb. Rain had begun again, light, insistent. Familiar. As they pulled away, Maigret glanced back at the hotel. Through the window, he could see the desk, empty, silent, the same ashtray, the same chair, and no one to fill it. Louis Morel had vanished without noise, not because he made enemies, but because he helped a man who did, and for once. Claude Revers had not disappeared on his own. The drizzle continued without change the next morning, soft and endless, soaking through the awnings of cafes and flattening the collars of coats. Paris was used to it by now, the kind of rain that demanded no response. No umbrella even, only quiet resignation. In the small square behind the Palais de Justice, Maigret sat beneath the iron overhang of a public bench, coat buttoned to the throat, pipe unlit in his hand. A folder rested beside him, sealed, but unnecessary. Every line it contained was already fixed in his mind. Claude Revers, alias Paul Viret, alias Gerard Vallon, alias Henry Lemoyne, had said little more after the arrest. At the station, he had answered questions with an exhausted clarity, never defensive, never theatrical. He confessed, not out of guilt, but out of fatigue. The story he gave was simple, and that simplicity made it believable. Yes, he had returned to Paris under another name, claiming to want a quiet life. Yes, he had taken a room at the Hotel Central, using the false name Volney, hoping to stay invisible. Yes, he had recognized a man across the street one night, a man from his past who had threatened to kill him if they ever crossed paths again. And yes, when that man entered the hotel during Revers's night shift, he had panicked. Only he hadn't been working the desk. Louis Morel had. Maigret still remembered how Revers had described the moment. He'd been in the back hallway, fixing the coat rack. The man entered. He saw Louis, same build, same coat. He turned back into the shadows and waited, long enough to hear Louis speak gently, offer a room key, long enough to know the mistake had been made. and then he watched them go. I could have stopped it, Revers had said, almost whispering, but I told myself I had a right to live. That sentence had stuck with Maigret. A right to live, as if life were something distributed according to cleverness, not character, as if survival were a prize one earned by watching others fall. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the paperwork had already begun. The murder charge would take time. There was no body yet, not officially. The clothes found near the lock were damning, but not final. Still, no one doubted the outcome now. Louis Morel was gone. The man who had written no letters, made no enemies, and lived every day with quiet routine had been erased by someone who knew how to make noise. Only in silence, Maigret rose slowly from the bench and walked toward the nearby cafe. It was early, enough that the tables were still empty, the windows still streaked with last night's mist. He sat in his usual corner and ordered coffee without looking at the menu. The waitress knew him. She placed the cup down without a word. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the glass. The world beyond it blurred and grey. He watched it for a long time. There was no satisfaction in the arrest. Revers would face trial, perhaps prison. But what did that bring back? A man had been replaced like a worn coat, and the city had carried on without noticing. Even now, the Hedel Central would have resumed its rhythm. A new clerk, fresh sheets, fresh guests. The bell would ring, the register would open, and the chair behind the desk would creak just as it always had. No plaque, no mention, just absence. Janvier arrived just before 9, coat dripping, expression unreadable. We found the body, he said simply. Maigret didn't react. He only stirred his coffee, behind a locked service gate near the old boathouse. We missed it the first time. Waited, as expected. Identification intact. Cause of death looks like strangulation. Maigret nodded once. So it's done, Janvier. Didn't sit. You want to go to the scene? No. Maigret said quietly. Not now. Press is asking questions. They're calling it the disappearance that solved itself. Maigret looked up then, with a brief, dry smile. Isn't that always how they prefer it? Janvier hesitated. You think Revers planned it that way? No. I think he planned nothing. That was always his problem. He was a man who reacted. He lied when cornered, disappeared when threatened, charmed when needed. But he never planned. He just kept moving, until someone stopped moving instead. Janvier nodded, then placed a small item on the table. It was a postcard, the kind tourists bought, but never sent. On the back, in faded blue ink, were 6 words. He was kind. I was not. No signature. Just that. Maigret turned it over. The front showed a canal scene. Bassin de la Villette. Peaceful. Ordinary. A couple. Walking along the bank. Arms linked. Found it in the apartment? Maigret asked. Janvier shook his head. No. It was posted. Arrived this morning. No return address. Maigret folded the card and slipped it into his coat. Some gestures were not for the courts. Some confessions came only when no one asked for them. The rain continued as Maigret walked back to headquarters. Not hard, not sharp. just steady. It filled the gutters and ran along the edges of the streets. It blurred the buildings. It softened the city. But it didn't wash anything away. In his office, he lit his pipe and stood by the window, watching the slow passage of cars and umbrellas. Somewhere, Claude Revers sat in a cell, staring at walls he could no longer talk his way past. Somewhere, the sister in Rouen would receive no letter this month or the next. And somewhere, a chair behind a hotel desk remained empty. Not because no one could fill it, but because no one could ever sit in it the same way again. Louis Morel hadn't been a hero. He hadn't chased anyone. He hadn't resisted. He had only done what he always did: answered a question, offered a key, listened. And for that, he had been mistaken for someone else. And for that, he had died. The tragedy was not the crime. The tragedy was how quietly it had happened.